Good evening. It's my pleasure to welcome everyone to Keeping It Local, a monthly series from September to April, hosted by the League of Women Voters of Champaign County to focus on local issues with local experts as presenters. You can join us by Zoom at 7 p.m. on the fourth Wednesday of each month. Information about upcoming Keeping It Local programs is on our website, lwvchampaigncounty.org. I'm Teresa Michelson, a member of the program team that plans these presentations. Our topic this evening is the Illinois legislature and specifically what goes on behind the scenes. This evening's presenter is Sean Crawford, the managing editor of NPR Illinois since 2009. He began his 40-year career in journalism as a high school student, broadcasting from a radio station in his hometown of Herrin, Illinois. For more than a dozen years, he was Statehouse Bureau Chief for NPR Illinois. He is currently the host of the weekly programs Statewide and State Week, which can be heard on Illinois public radio stations. And I just found out that State Week is also a podcast, so you can access it that way. Before we turn the program over to Sean, a few reminders. Please keep yourself muted. There will be 10 or 15 minutes after the presentation for questions. If you have a question, please put it in the chat. Carol, Bosley, and Ann Panthen will get to as many as possible. Sean, the floor, or maybe I should say the Zoom screen is yours. So we're looking forward to hearing to what you have to say.
Well, thanks very much. Thanks for having me. I appreciate it. I figured when people hear we're going to talk about state government, they might be going, I wonder if something's on television tonight they could watch. You know, it's not always a topic that's close to people. And I think that's part of the problem with state government. It doesn't feel very accessible to a lot of people compared to, say, your city council, your school board, township boards. You can go to those meetings a lot easier. They're very close. If your road is having a problem, you can go talk to your alderman, your city council person. Compared to state government, it just seems like it's not as close to people, but it impacts people in a lot of ways. When I started at the Capitol, I remember talking to a reporter once, an older reporter, and I said, how do you keep this interesting for people? Do people pay attention to it? And he says, it's our job to make them interested because it impacts them in so many ways. And what I used to find at the Capitol was a lot of people would not show up to hearings and different types of votes that are taking place until it's something that really impacts them, and it could be something that brings thousands of people to Springfield. And sometimes it brings maybe just a dozen or so, but once it impacts you, state government's on the radar. You gave the background for me, so I won't go through all of that. I will say that I grew up in a family with both Republicans and Democrats, although it was at a time, we're talking in the 70s, early 80s, that we really didn't talk about politics by sitting around the table or anything like that. That was just not part of it. Although my great aunt was a Democratic precinct committee woman, and was certainly diametrically opposed, politically at least, to some of the ideas of some other people in the family, but there were never any arguments, never had that stuff. I went and spent a lot of time with her as a young kid, and I helped her out a lot going around when I was 6, 7 years old, helping her fill out the sample ballots, trying to get people to register to vote, just going with her. And I really saw that grassroots political activism. Doesn't mean I'm a Democrat necessarily or Republican. I have friends who are all the political spectrum. And but one thing I noticed about her, and I will just point this out, and we'll get into some things about state government, and it's affected me through the years and how I look at politics, is that she was a staunch Democrat, very involved in the labor movement. She worked at an industrial job, and she was Democrat through and through. But even as a precinct committee woman, there was one Republican elected official in our county. He was county clerk, had been the county clerk for like 20 years. She would not work against him. She'd hand out the sample ballots with all the Democrats checked, but she wouldn't go out of her way to work against him because she knew him, she liked him, they were friends, and even though he was on the other side, she still could, separate herself in that respect. And I think that's what's missing at times from politics. Too many labels rather than just sitting down saying, hey, I see it differently than you. It'd be nice if we all agreed, but that isn't the way it's always going to be. Doesn't mean I dislike you or I'm going to work really hard to tarnish your reputation. And we see too much of that, I think, these days. But I did want to mention that because I always tell people about that story. I think she's somebody that really sort of put me on a path to being interested in politics. But anyway, Teresa had given me some rough questions to kind of guide what to talk about here. And I figure if somebody does have a question earlier and wants to weigh in on things, just feel free. That's fine. However you guys want to handle that. But one of the things was just sort of how do things work at the state house? So, for it is a big operation. There are a lot of people who work there, not just state lawmakers, not just the governor. Staff do really most of the heavy lifting at the Capitol. So those are people you never hear of. You don't know them. You don't vote for them, but they're behind the scenes making sure things get done. In many cases, they are writing the legislation for the lawmakers. So that's staff. They're checking things out. So if you wanted to say change some type of law about education, there was a research staff. Both, and all the parties have this, all the caucuses have this, House Republicans, Senate Republicans, House Democrats, Senate Democrats, and they will research statutes, they will research all the law books to make sure that, best that they can, that this legislation does what it's supposed to do and stays within the law. So again, staff is something that I think most people probably just don't know and don't understand, and why should they? They're not there every day. Um, People also at the Capitol see things differently based on where they're from. So a Democrat from Southern Illinois is probably going to be a lot different than a Democrat, and there aren't many of those left these days. But those Democrats from Chicago. So you'll find that's much different. Now, if you represent, say, Champaign County, the U of I is there, pretty good chance you're going to be focused in on higher education issues, including higher ed funding. But if you don't have an institution like that in your district, maybe that's not your top priority. So it's really a hodgepodge of people. It's not just black and white of Democrat, Republican. It can just be a lot different based on geography. So just wanted to mention that as well. It's a representative form of government that can get messy at times, but it's where a lot of the needs and ideas come from various parts of the state. When I was growing up, I remember Paul Simon, who was for a while also involved in state politics. Then he moved on to Congress and later as a U.S. senator, ran for president. But Paul Simon had to represent the area he was from when he was in Congress in that fact of things like the Clean Air Act, because it would hurt the coal mines in that area. So he had to take a different view on some of these things. At times, people had to take votes that they may not have even always agreed with, but they are representing their constituents. So that is something we can talk about later, but that's something to me, if you're an activist and you're somebody who wants to make change, you have to take that into account. So it's just something to keep in mind. It's not as simple as Fox News or CNN or people like that make it out to be. And I think that's what makes state government such an interesting place to be. How do bills move through? That was one of the questions. Starts with an idea. So often that idea comes from a constituent. I've told young reporters I've worked with through the years, there's a story behind most of these bills. So you might say, well, this bill would make it, would do something to basically something with, I'll just throw one out, background checks on school bus drivers, something like that. And it would maybe add something to the background check. Well, there's a story that probably occurred there. There was some issue that happened that the law didn't cover. And that is why somebody is pitching that idea. We had a bill just recently, took a little while to get through, called Karina's bill. You might be familiar with this, but it had to do with domestic violence incidents. And when somebody got an order of protection against them, they would lose their that person who had the order filed against them would lose their gun privileges during that period of time. Still don't know how this is going to work. It's relatively new law, but again, it came out of a very tragic situation in which a woman was attacked by a former boyfriend of hers, and her son was killed. And that's the type of thing that will, lead to legislation. It's a very reactive place, the Illinois Capitol. Usually, something happens because an action has taken place, an action and a reaction. So anyway, if there's something there, feel free to ask about that if you want to, if anybody's got a question. But I'll just keep going. Um, so we talked about lawmakers. Those are the people who are elected House and Senate representatives and senators. As I mentioned, staff does a lot of the heavy lifting. They put a lot of this together. That doesn't mean that lawmakers don't write legislation. Some are very involved in that, others not so much. Just depends on who it is. You can't always also expect that the lawmaker is very effective because they pass a bunch of legislation. Lawmakers do a lot of work back in their district. I would bet somebody on here has had to contact a state lawmaker, a local lawmaker, about an issue of maybe their parents needing some Medicaid assistance, maybe nursing homes or something to that effect. Or it could be something else that they've contacted them about. They do what's called constituent services. And staff also does a lot of this, the staff that's back in the district offices. But that to me is usually how somebody is considered effective. Less about passing a ton of legislation, although that can be good at times. It's more about that. It's often about the budget. It's about what they get put in the budget for their districts, protecting certain things, maybe expanding in certain areas. But really, a lot of it has to do with that one-on-one interaction that happens back in a district. So I just want to make that clear as well. Um, and I saw a couple of questions there. If somebody has that, let me just finish this one point. Interest groups. I think somebody mentioned lobbyists, the role of them. Um, the lobbyists are, well, they vary. There's a couple of different types of lobbyists. There's special interest groups. I'll throw out one, the teachers unions. They have lobbyists. They're pretty heavily financed at the Capitol with lobbyists. And then there's something called contract lobbyist. And that is a person who, we consider a hired gun almost, a person who goes to the Capitol, works at the Capitol, has several clients. And they're basically hired by a group or some cause that doesn't need a full-time lobbyist, but maybe they're trying to get legislation through this year, or they're working on one thing, and that's where often you will see these contract lobbyists come in. They get paid a certain amount of money, and they know what they're doing, most of them, I'd say, and they've been the ear of the lawmakers, and they say, hey, this is something that we'd like you to take a look at or really consider voting for, and just goes through the motions throughout an entire session and sometimes even beyond that. So contract lobbyists, and then lobbyists who are employed full-time. University of Illinois, a classic example, has its own lobbyists. But you've got to get those special interests support quite often to pass legislation. Could be that you're trying to do something that would that some people might view as some restrictions on law enforcement, something or other, on police, requiring them to do something. Quite often, the police chiefs in the state, they have their own lobbyists. They will often weigh in on this, and that may, if they're okay with it, or if they work on legislation, try to come to some agreement, that will often sway votes. Whereby somebody may say, nope, if the police chiefs aren't for it, I'm not going to vote for it. So just a lot of this back and forth that goes on. I mean, when the bill passes, when it gets to the floor for a vote, there's just been hours and hours and hours of work that's been done on most of this legislation, because all of these people have weighed in for so long. Chamber of Commerce, I mentioned teachers union, municipal league, which represents local governments, just some of the really, I would say, more effective and important groups, but there's just tons of them that are represented by lobbyists. So was there another question? I didn't want to. go too far along if I missed something, if somebody had one.
Oh, there was a question about our staff currently as bipartisan as elected people are?
Staff bipartisan?
Oh, no, I mean,
Let's
partisan. I'm sorry, wrong word.
as partisan, I should.
Yeah.
I think again that depends on the people. Now I've known people. I won't name drop a lot, but one a good example of somebody who worked on a Republican staff that I knew when I would say he was just a young person. I was much younger then too. Rodney Davis. So he was a congressman from here. That's how he got his start. Was working as a staff member in the Illinois House Republicans, and he went on from there. He later became a staffer for John Shimkus, I believe, the former congressman, and later, of course, ran for himself. So these are people who not all of them are going to run for political office, but some of them, and most of them, I would say, are very smart and they really take the job seriously. And they may have certain viewpoints here or there, but I don't see that affecting them and the work they do most of the time. These are people who really put in a lot of time and effort. They don't get paid all that much most of the time. A lot of grunt work, I would call it. But they really make the place go. It's not the lawmakers, although the lawmakers, a lot of them do a lot of work, but their work is often back in the district as well. But it's the staff that really make a big difference. And it's something that I would say if you ever, we can get into this a bit later, but if you're, again, somebody trying to affect change, and I would always argue one of the ways to do that is go out to, say, a town hall meeting or what they call office hours. Sometimes a lot of these folks have, and they may only have a staff member there. It may not be the elected official, but getting to know that staff member really does help. You can say, "Hey, Joe," or Mary, whoever it is, uh, and maybe you can get their personal phone number or contact information, and you can write them directly. And they have the ear of the lawmaker quite often, and it's just important to make connections. That to me is what it's all about. That's what you see at the Capitol. I don't know how many people have ever been to see a legislative session at the Capitol, but you have on one side of the building the Senate, one side is the House, and when it's really busy, in the middle there's a brass rail that goes around in a circle. Actually, the circle goes all the way up to the roof where the dome is, but it's called the rotunda area. And in that rotunda and all the way up through between the chambers, there's lobbyists hanging out, and they know each other, and they chat quite a bit. But a lawmaker walks out of one of the chambers, pretty good chance somebody's going to buttonhole that person and talk to them for a few minutes about something. So they're getting hit a lot. It's not always the best place to come and try to, as just a regular person to come and try to meet with them. That's the time to do that stuff. I find quite often is when they're back in their district, so things are a little less busy. But but again, a lot of different approaches work on something like that. Um, I mentioned the lobbyists and others. Bills, just because they're written a certain way, they often have to be rewritten, maybe several times. So what, always throws a lot of reporters, I think, is okay. Here's a gambling legislation's been introduced in January, and you're looking through this of everything it would do, and Bill's still sitting there, and maybe it gets approved out of a committee, um, and uh, and you're still sitting there waiting for a floor vote on it. And then all of a sudden, near the very end of the session, and I'm talking in the final days, sometimes even hours, hey, that bill is back, and it does a lot of different things than it did before. That's not uncommon. That doesn't mean that they just decided to rewrite that thing. They've been working on it, but again, everything morphs. It changes as the process moves along. So again, if you're really interested, when I talk to people like you guys, I always think to myself, there may be somebody there at some point who wants to get some piece of legislation through. They might just support it. They may not be that actively involved, and they want the people at the Capitol to know about that. You just have to stay on top of it. That's a lot easier now than it used to be because the legislation is online, but it can turn in an instant, especially near the end of session. So it's just about staying involved, staying up to date on things. Somebody asked about transparency. um, I think it is pretty transparent if that's your job to watch what's going on. But if you've got a job or you want to hang out with your kids, or you want to hang out with your grandkids, and not watch the legislature all the time, it can be a little hard because you're not going to get information for the most part. And even media, the staffing's just not there the way it used to be. When I worked at the Capitol all the time, and I don't work there all the time now, but when I worked there all the time, it was busy. There were a lot of reporters covering legislation and lawmakers and the governor, and it's just a handful now that do this on a regular basis. So I don't know that you can stay as up to date on if you're really paying attention to this stuff, you're going to have to go and do some of it yourself. You're going to have to look for hearings. A lot of that's online. Most of this stuff is online, but it does take a lot of work. So transparent. I don't think anybody's trying to pull something over on people for the most part. It's just that it's the way the process works. It's the way it's worked since I've been there. Yeah, chaotic at the end of the session, very much so. Budgets, I think Teresa asked about this, is like it seems like the budget gets put together at the last minute. Well, it's actually most of the budget is put together really early on because there's just certain things. In fact, if you remember Bruce Rauner, former governor, when they couldn't get a budget deal worked out, and we had an impasse that lasted for a couple of years. Most things still got funded in the state, and that was because of court cases that basically said, nope, you gotta fund this. You've got to pay for Medicaid bills. You've got to do all of these different things. So so basically, there most of it is there. Then the final numbers get switched around a little bit. What usually happens at the end of a session with the budget is projects possibly. So maybe it's somebody wanting a road construction or a sewer plant for one of the towns in their district that might get thrown in. There can be certain pet projects too, like the governor's got something right now that he wants to, you may have read this, wants to take community colleges and have them give 4-year degrees. That's something from what I've been able to surmise. 4-year colleges and universities are not terribly hip on that right now. So that might happen, but if it does, it'll probably happen at the very end of the session. So we won't really see legislation maybe until the very end, and there may have to be some money put aside for that as well. So that's how a lot of this stuff happens at the very end. And I think that it's unfortunate, and they've tried to do a little bit better job of this, but it still happens at the very end. It's hard to get people coming together till the very end, till the deadline is really upon them. But it doesn't help people's view of government, I think, because people feel as though, even if I don't think that's necessarily happening, that something terrible is being put in the budget at the last second all the time, and that's the reason for it taking to the very end. I still think it makes people wonder, and it makes people concerned, just like a lot of scandals that we see. I don't think most people at the Capitol are corrupt, despite what some people may think. I don't think I've covered these people for a long time. They go there, I think, for the right reasons. Most of them, they work hard at it. They are tempted at times. Some people, they make mistakes and they do things that they probably shouldn't do. But that isn't everybody, so you can't paint everybody with a broad brush. But those things help create this view by people that it's a corrupt system and everybody in it's corrupt. So that's just my take on that. But anyway, I didn't want to go too long on that topic. Was there something else or any other question I missed there? I know some people sent stuff in, but
There was a question. What bills do you think will be most controversial in the spring session?
well, I think I don't know that there's going to be a whole lot. I think I mentioned that one on the 4-year community college programs, but I don't know how controversial it truly is. It's controversial for colleges and universities who are fearful. I think they could lose students, to that. But I don't know if that's, and maybe it'll happen, maybe that won't. Another one that's out there right now has to do with homeschooling. That's actually drew a ton of response recently. More people are homeschooling their kids these days. And so there's some legislation that would require more restrictions on that. It would require more information by a homeschooling parent to tell the state exactly what they're doing, and a lot of other details about it that a lot of them don't want. So that, if it were to make it through, and I think that'll be a tough one. If it does make it through, though, that would be one of the controversy ones. I think it'll be debated up till the very end. There's some ideas about changing gambling laws. I mentioned gambling earlier. I won't bore you with all that. If you're not a gambler, you may not care as much, but some of that, and a lot of this would be trying to raise more money. There's also some hemp product legislation that some people think would also bring in some additional money. That's most of what I'm seeing right now. The biggest issue for state government, and for those that don't listen to our show, the person that's on with me every week, and then we have other guest reporters, but is Charlie Wheeler. Charlie's a retired professor, but he was also a journalist for about 50 years at the Sun-Times. And Charlie still follows government very closely. And Charlie believes this budget year is the most difficult one that he's seen. And that's saying a lot because the state's been in worse financial shape. But the uncertainty right now with the Trump administration is really key. We don't know, for example, I keep throwing out things that are related to Champaign area, but we don't know what enrollment at colleges and universities is going to look like because we don't know if there's going to be the financial aid for a lot of kids to go. We don't know about foreign students, for example. We don't know about research money. So there could be a need for additional resources for higher education if things don't turn out the way they hope. We don't know about some of these other programs. Medicaid is a big one. We don't know exactly what money will be coming from Washington. In the past, you could pretty much estimate that, and we don't know. We just have no clue at this point. And and of course, tariffs are being not only talked about, but I saw today the president announcing a tariff on these foreign-made autos, but we don't know what that means for business in the state of Illinois, sales taxes. We don't know about jobs, people's jobs at this point, what that could mean. So even income taxes could take a hit. So it's very difficult to sit here and put a major budget together and say, and it won't take effect till July 1st, that it's going to last you all next year. This is the way things are going to be. I don't know that we're going to know that by that point. So it's the budget's really going to be probably more key than almost any year because it's a crapshoot right now on what's going to happen and what money is going to come through from the federal government or other changes that could happen that could impact it. And that the budget's really the big thing. They don't need to do anything else at the Capitol in a year except pass a budget. That's their whole reason for being there. Instead, you'll get 6,000 pieces of legislation introduced. But the budget is the key one, and it's the one that probably has the most lobbying through the years too, is because everybody wants to make sure either you're lobbying to get something put in the budget or you're lobbying to keep something in the budget. That I think is stressing a lot of people right now, and so people are unclear what the future holds. But yeah, that would be my take on that. Now, something may pop up tomorrow that I would change that answer and say, oh, that's going to be a big piece of legislation, but I haven't seen a whole lot else yet. There's some really interesting bills in my mind out there to read about, but those might be the ones that take the most attention. So was there something else there too?
Well, I think you may have answered a lot of this question. Yeah, the feds are cutting many programs. How is the state handling that? Who at the state follows this?
Well, the governor certainly does. And the governor, of course, I don't think I'm speaking out of turn to say he is definitely looking at his political future. The governor, J.B. Pritzker, we haven't had a 3-term governor since Jim Thompson. He may decide to run. We're going to find that out probably in just a few months. He's going to either decide he almost has to decide here over the next few months. And so we're going to know if he's still going to be in the mix. I think he will, is my guess. Right now, I don't know what else he would do, but he is sort of taking on Trump for various reasons, I think. One of them is I don't think he likes Donald Trump, and I don't think he likes what Donald Trump is doing. But he's also setting himself up politically to be the antagonist to Donald Trump and the Trump administration. So you're seeing him on a lot of network TV, news channels. You're seeing him go and speak in Florida and some other key places. He's doing a lot of that work. So he's going to be one of the main ones. From a budget standpoint, the state comptroller, Susana Mendoza, she's the one that pays the bills for the state. She also, I think, has political aspirations beyond that office. So you will hear her a lot as well. But a lot of that's just doing the job that she was elected to do, which is saying, hey, not sure if we're going to have enough money for this, or this is a real concern. So we're going to hear a lot of that coming from Springfield here over the next, I would say, the next couple of months for sure, and probably will beyond that. So.
We have another question. Do our elected officials in Springfield have much interaction with our elected officials who represent us in Washington? If so, how does that happen?
Well, keep in mind our congressional delegation, and we're not counting the senators. There's two of them, Dick Durbin, Tammy Duckworth, both Democrats. But there's 17, and so there are members of the House. And so there are 14 Democrats, only 3 Republicans. Mary Miller, Darren LaHood, and Mike Bost, all from Central or Southern Illinois. I don't think considering we're all Democrat at the state level for all the constitutional offices, I don't think there is a lot of interaction right now between them. I wouldn't have said that necessarily even a couple of years ago. I think Darren LaHood's been somebody who's worked okay with Democrats for the most part. And I think sometimes Democrats will work with a Republican because of something that's beneficial to everybody. But right now is a very polarizing time. The others certainly, I think, probably are, but and this is a whole nother show, but it's whether or not Democrats feel as though people in Washington, the elected officials there, like the members of Congress, are standing up enough to the Trump administration. And that's something that's getting into a whole different political discussion. And my guess is some do and some don't. J.B. Pritzker is going to really rattle the cage a lot more, again, because he is trying to make a name for himself. He's trying to separate himself from a crowd that's still pretty large when it comes to who might run for the Democratic nomination for president. So I think you're going to see a little less of that. In fact, Dick Durbin is from Springfield, so I've been in his house. We've covered him, different times and such. And whether you like Dick Durbin or not, I would argue he's an intelligent fellow, and he really knows the process. He can be partisan, but that's his role. He's now the minority whip in the Senate. But he's coming under a lot of fire right now from, basically taking a side that Chuck Schumer took. So I think there's just a lot of musical chairs that could be played here very soon with some of these Democratic lawmakers and other elected officials. I'm not lawmakers, I'm sorry, elected officials who may want to run for different offices. I think could be some challenges going on in the city of Chicago for the mayor's race there. There has been talk of people who are, constitutional officers who may run for that. Certainly, if Dick Durbin were to step aside, he's 80 years old. If he doesn't run for another term, I would bet somebody, probably maybe more than one, are going to try to run for that seat. If J.B. Pritzker decides I'm going to not run for governor, I'm going to try to go on the campaign trail for the next couple of years, then certainly there'll be openings there. So there's just a lot of movement, I think, about to happen in politics. And most of the people who are going to play a key role in that are elected officials who serve in state government at this point. Less on the House and Senate side, I think, but more of these constitutional offices. Did we catch up, or was that about?
We caught up with the questions in the chat. Teresa, do you have any questions?
Yeah, I have a couple because I can't write them in there. Getting back to people, are there senators or state, representatives that are more influential than other folks, whose names kind of pop up. Yeah, if you understand what I mean
Yeah.
about.
Yeah, I think and somebody who's he made a name for himself before because he was an elected official at the state level before, but he's now the Secretary of State, Alexei Janulius. His name is bandied about a lot, possibly running for the U.S. Senate, possibly running for mayor of Chicago. His name's come up for that as well. He really has done, I would say, a good job in the sense of making sure people know who he is and what he's doing. His press operation's been pretty strong since he took over the position, doing things like uh, trying to eliminate some of the wait at driver's license facilities and doing different things with that. Now he's got this Real ID, which is a federal rule that's coming down, but for those, that's something you guys can look up. But it's something that he's pushing pretty heavily. There's there all of these Democrats, most of them now have been in office for some time. I mean, Mike Frericks was a state senator from over there in Champaign. But he's been the state treasurer now for a couple of terms. He's gotten name ID. Mendoza, somebody else. The lieutenant governor, Juliana Stratton, seems to be really putting together a fundraising operation. So all of these people, I think are ready to make some noise politically. Republican wise, I'm not seeing as much of that. Republicans have a lot harder time because they need to do somewhat well in Chicago. And even though Donald Trump did better in the state of Illinois than many people predicted last time, I still don't think it's enough to pull out state government these seats and all. So I think that's unless the right person comes along. Mark Kirk was probably more of a moderate when he was elected to the U.S. Senate. Bruce Rauner on a lot of issues was considered a moderate as well. In fact, that's probably what got him really beat by his own party was he was not conservative enough on certain issues. So those folks, if that's what you're asking, I mean, to me, there's a lot of names out here right now that are interesting. I think you had asked me earlier to talk about the kingpins, so to speak, at the Capitol. Um, there are four different legislative leaders and the governor. And oftentimes when it comes to budget negotiations, high level or any other really high level negotiation, those are the people that are often involved. That would be the House Speaker. Right now, that's a Democrat, Chris Welch. Senate President, which is a Democrat, Don Harmon. And then you have the two Republican leaders in each chamber, Tony McCombie in the House and John Curran in the Senate. But they are in what's known as a super minority. And that means not just that they're in the minority, the other party has a majority. They have veto proof and well beyond that, actually, meaning that if the governor vetoed a bill and you wanted to come back and put enough Democratic votes on it, you could. It's very simple to do because they have so many, I shouldn't say simple, but they have a lot of people who could make that work. Uh, Republicans are in probably the weakest position I've seen since I've been covering government because at times they've been actually pretty strong. But part of that reason is not because necessarily, oh, Donald Trump's this or their message is out of date. Some people can argue that. A lot of it has to do with redistricting. And redistricting is something that takes place every 10 years based on the census. But for you in Champaign, it would mean that Carol Ammon's district, for example, may look different geographically based on what the Democrats, because they're the party in control, would decide to do with that district. They would craft a district to elect a Democrat, but it might suddenly, you might have been in her district at one point before, now you're not. We see it at the congressional level. Mary Miller now represents a wide swath of central Illinois, whereby before she had been elected and really only represented a smaller portion of the region. That redistricting, it's long, it can be an arcane topic, so I don't want to get into it too much, but it really does impact everything because I can take an area and I can say, okay, well, there's 3 Democrats and 3 Republicans that represent this area. And I could probably put together a map that suddenly is going to elect 4 or 5 Democrats instead of 3, and that would bring down the Republicans down to 1. So that's happened a lot, and with Democrats in control, that will likely happen again. I don't see that changing, and I'd be shocked if that happened in the next election. So it's not the best way to do things. There's a lot of better ways to do it. Other states have done a more scientific approach to this, but really it's a political process. And the courts have upheld most of these challenges to it. So it's I won't, like I said, I won't spend much time on this, but it to me is one of the key areas of how parties keep control, and how I think people feel quite often as if they have no voice, because they may be, a very conservative person and they've got the most liberal person they could find to be the elected official here, and vice versa, because of the way the districts are drawn. So I think that's unfortunate, but yeah, there was another question I think came in. I don't want to spend all the time with it.
You had mentioned the importance of developing relationships with staff. Other than attending a town hall, how would we find the names and contact information for staff members?
I think quite a few of them are online. You have to look, and I think the General Assembly just re-upped its website in some way or redid it in some way. And I haven't looked at that part. So I think if you go looking, you can find like a chief of staff for people, things of that nature. I did put a couple of notes, and let me look back at what I said on it, but because I get this a lot from people is, well, how do I make a difference? And I think, and I understand this completely. People feel like, I don't like what they're doing, but what are you going to do? Well, honestly, you'd be really shocked, I think, to find that they do respond and listen to constituents' calls, emails, even the old-fashioned letters, attending a town hall. Now, I'm not saying that by doing this, they're going to vote the way you want, but if enough people do reach out, it suddenly becomes an issue for them to say, I can't ignore this anymore. There are enough people there. That's why I think groups, that when you can get in with a group, there was, I think you guys had like Prairie Rivers Network, for example. Well, if Prairie Rivers Network decides to say, hey, we're going to mobilize as many people as we can to contact their elected official, that can go a long way to changing a vote, or at least changing somebody's view on something, because I don't think they are all there just solely to get reelected, but it does play a key role. And if they feel like there's an undercurrent in my district and I can't vote against it, again, this gets back to redistricting. If you're in such a safe district where it doesn't matter, you may not listen as much as you should to your constituents because you figure you're going to win anyway. But I don't think anybody should take anything for granted anymore. And I think that to me is what representative government's all about, is staying in touch with your lawmakers, letting them know you like what they're doing or don't like what they're doing. And I think you also, another way to go about this is to be a little bit politically savvy, in the sense that, let's say, the lawmaker is going to vote for something because it seems somewhat popular. You're not a big fan of this. Maybe come up with the argument that they can then give back to somebody else and say, hey, I know that I know this wasn't the most popular thing to do when I voted for it, but here's why. Think about it from a lawmaker's perspective, because they're hearing from a lot of different sources. So just as though you may be the most fervent supporter of something, there might be a fervent opponent who's in their ear as well. So it's just about trying to develop relationships with them, with the staff, as I mentioned, but also letting your voice be heard. And you'd be shocked. I've seen it happen many times where something seems pretty innocuous piece of legislation, and suddenly there's a groundswell of opposition to it. And the next thing you know, that bill's not going anywhere because they've listened. and they don't want to do something that's too controversial quite often. So it's a good opportunity to again let them know that you're paying attention and let them hear from you.
Teresa, you have any more questions?
Yeah. So it's sort of about news access these days. In addition to your programming on NPR, what are the most reliable and most accessible sources for following important things happening in Springfield?
Well, I think there's and this has changed a lot in the last several years. I think a group that does a really good job, and it's only come about in the last, I don't know, 6, 7 years or so. It's called Capital News Illinois, and you'll read articles from them in newspapers. I'm not sure if the News Gazette publishes them. I bet it does. A lot of these newspapers no longer have people at the Capitol. As I'd mentioned earlier, we had tons of reporters from all over the state who would be there either full time or come in during session days. So it really got a lot of attention. They don't have that staff anymore. That's just the unfortunate way it is. But the Capital News Illinois, folks, it is a initiative of the Press Association in the state, and I don't know how many reporters they have now, 6, 7, maybe more. But I think they're all really sharp folks, and they do a really good job of bringing information about different pieces of legislation. They're not a political reporting operation. So they don't report on the governor's race or this or that. They report on what's happening in public policy. And I think they do a really good job. I think they're very balanced. If somebody's looking at that being an issue, and they just keep you up to date on what's going on. Now they can only do so much again, but and that's just where not having reporters all over the state, I think, kind of hurt, because sometimes somebody would be watching what one lawmaker is doing in one part of the state because that's their local lawmaker. And a lot of these news organizations just don't have that staff anymore. Yeah, I think NPR does a good job. We're not as staffed as we used to be either, and most of us are not. So we're all kind of doing the best we can. There's also some very insider, I guess you would call them, political newsletters and websites. Capital Facts, that's with an O, capital, and FAX is what it, because it started out as a daily fax to different people who really want to keep up in government, including lobbyists and such. But they have a website, capitalfax.com, which is really probably the insider's site, go-to site in state government. And a lot of times it will tell you about something that's being reported somewhere, but oftentimes it will have some updating about what's happening behind the scenes. There's another one called the Illinois with a Z. You can look that up. That's a former Republican staffer who puts that out. It's an emailed newsletter. I think there may be a cost to that one, but it's pretty nominal. Of course, the Tribune, the Sun-Times do a really good job. They're now probably the two papers that I would say still do a decent job. But again, staffing is not what it once was. The Sun-Times just announced about 20% of its newsroom was going to retire and take a buyout package. So I think you just have to look online. There's also people that have these Twitter or X accounts and things like that. Some of them are pretty good too, but you just kind of have to do your own work, I think, and see what you like. But I'd say Capital Facts and Capital News Illinois are probably two of the real key ones. So I would always tell people to look at those.
Okay,
Capital News Illinois is TAL, right?
TOL. Yeah, I think it's. I think
Okay.
it is. I'd have to look that up again. I haven't bookmarked, so I don't call it up. But you'll find it if you just probably type either one. It'll probably take you to it. So. And they're based at the Capitol, and that's the nice thing too. Some reporters are not. So
we have another question. Today, President Trump issued an executive order making voting and voting registration more difficult. Is there someone in our state house who handles such issues at the state level?
as far as somebody whose job it is to sort of watch voting and things like that, or making that type of thing, I'm guessing. We have the State Board of Elections, which is something to watch for. There's also lawmakers who are very concerned on these types of issues. Um, they're a little more partisan. I would say the State Board of Elections folks are really more fact-based. They're just the types to say, this is how this would impact you. I saw this today, but I don't know exactly how it would impact people. I couldn't speak to it yet. And I always find this when it comes to the federal government. I pay a lot of attention to state and even some local government. Federal government's a whole nother thing. It's like it's hard sometimes to try to feel like you have any type of expertise in covering it, because I'm not in Washington and I don't know what's going on. I read again another site, I should say, another newsletter, and it is free. Is Politico. They have one for Illinois. You can look that up. But Politico at the national level is a really good newsletter to get. I would suggest people, and it's an email, so you can just you can either, if you don't like it, you can just go ahead and unsubscribe to it. But it comes every day, and oftentimes with some updating. And they do a really good job, I think, too. So both the federal and the state one, but I think you'll have to do both to subscribe to those. But Politico's a big one, and ProPublica, somebody mentioned there, it is more of an in-depth reporting setup, I think. We worked with them a few years back on a couple of stories, and this had to do with the University of Illinois, actually. Um, so they're not putting stories out every single day, but the ones they do put out are investigative pieces, and they really do a good job. And it's not just in Illinois, they're across the country. So I would say that's another one. There is some really good work being done. What I think is being hurt these days is your local newspaper, local TV and radio. They're just not able to do what they once did. And that's where I think people are losing out on local news coverage. State government coverage, there's probably fewer voices weighing in on that now, and fewer viewpoints, which I think is always valuable to have. Um, but there's still some good reporting being done. But there are some communities where I would argue there's hardly any reporting being done. And these are some decent sized cities in the state. And that's just due to a lack of personnel to go out and cover things. So, our paper here, the State Journal Register, it was the paper of record for state government. And when I worked at the Capitol, they had so many reporters, they'd bump into each other at times at different events, like, oh, I didn't know you were coming here. Well, I guess now I'm here. So, but they would sometimes have 3 pages a day on just state government coverage. This bill is advancing and this is happening. Well, you could keep up to date on almost anything going on. And that's just not how it is anymore. In fact, like I said, they don't have a reporter totally assigned to the Capitol anymore. So, they're not alone. It's just the fact that they're in Springfield makes that hurt a little bit more. But we're seeing a decline at a really. I would say that some people would say, "Oh, this is the worst time." I don't know. There's never a good time to not have sunlight, I think, being put on government, and I think that it only makes government better when it is out there. And unfortunately, we're just in a bad period for journalism, and hopefully it'll improve, but we'll see. So I did want to mention, go ahead, I'm sorry.
No, you go. You go.
One of the things you did ask me real quick, and I mentioned too, is these unofficial caucuses and coalitions that are out there. That's something else to keep in mind. I can't even keep up with it now, because there used to be there was the Black Caucus, and there was the Latino Caucus, and there were a few others. And what this is just what it sounds like. It's, most of the Black lawmakers belong to the Black Caucus. They would meet on their own and kind of take positions on different pieces of legislation or what their priorities were. And in some ways, that actually made the process better, because what it allowed is sometimes, like, this might be something Black lawmakers may not be in favor of. Well, you could negotiate or talk with Black lawmakers through the caucus and kind of get a better feel for, are they on board or are they not on board? So when you're trying to get votes rounded up, it helped. Now you have, there's caucuses for the environment. There's caucuses for, I think, higher education. There's caucuses there's the Freedom Caucus, which is based out of some people out of Eastern Illinois. that are very, what you would consider probably more farther right, pretty conservative folks. So there's just a lot of different caucuses, but they don't make the process any worse or anything like that. But they all have their agendas, their priorities, and such. So you may hear their names get thrown about at times as far as those types of caucuses. You may hear that and wonder, well, what's that about? It's just the fact that these people have sort of created their own individual groups within the larger groups. But somebody mentioned the Open Meetings Act. That's correct. The legislature is not bound by the Open Meetings Act. That's the way it was written. So you will have these closed door meetings, caucuses, and things happen, where they will talk about things and what they want to do, and reporters sit outside and hope that somebody comes out and tells them what happened. But it's that's just that process. That's when you write the legislation, you can write it sometimes to make yourself a little less accountable. For the most part, I've usually found there is lawmakers who will tell you what has taken place. Everybody likes to gossip a little bit. Everybody likes to be the one to spread some information. So when reporters ask enough, especially really good reporters who have these connections, they usually find out what's taken place. Same thing, I think, at local governments when they go into executive sessions and stuff. You can often find out what took place by just having a good relationship with somebody on the council, something like that. So, but it can be a challenge though to cover. So.
We have a question. Given the partisan divide in our country, do you have any advice for organizations like the League of Women Voters to keep voters engaged in our democracy?
Sure. I think you guys do a really good job. I mean, I've always viewed the League of Women Voters as really more about information to people, maybe hosting a debate, things of that nature, but also getting out information about how to vote or where to vote and, different things. But I think having these types of events really help a lot too. And nowadays, with the ability to do things via Zoom or put them online where people can listen when they want, it just attracts a larger audience than the old days of trying to get everybody in a room together at one time. But I think there's a lot of people concerned right now. I've always been a believer that the voting public, doesn't really like change as much as they think they do. They like the idea of it. They'll vote for it, and say, "Oh, well, yes, it's about time we did this." But once things start happening, it's like that's a little too much. And Donald Trump, I have said this to people before, whether you like Donald Trump or not, you have to give credit in the fact that he has pretty much told people what he was going to do, and he has acted on a lot of it since he's been in office. So he feels, I think, that this is what people voted for, that he has some type of mandate. I'm just not sure that there's ever really that type of a mandate for major change. I think people would just prefer to say, okay, well, maybe no more of this, but that's as far as I want it to go, and I don't know where that ends with Donald Trump and the rest of the Republican caucus in Washington, but like I said, I think having these types of conversations with people, and I think also that just because somebody may not agree politically, doesn't mean that you just shun those people and turn them out. I think it's an opportunity to engage. I have a lot of friends on my social media. As I mentioned, I grew up in Southern Illinois. They're pretty red, those folks, many of them. And I have what I would consider to be the lakefront liberals of Chicago, because I've known some of these people through work at the Capitol. They're about as progressive as it comes. And I like them both, and yeah, I get tired of hearing from both sides at times. But at the same time, I think it's important to be hearing those voices and kind of knowing as a reporter, where are they coming from? I said this on our show, and I know we're about out of time, but I said on the show a couple of weeks back that I was not surprised Donald Trump won in 2016. And I think I was the only one in our newsroom who felt that way. Because I think a lot of them were stunned by it. But I had been seeing this rising up from a lot of people, from the Tea Party movement to people feeling as though they just weren't being heard. And like I said, it didn't shock me when it happened. I didn't know that he was going to win for sure, but I just felt like he had a real shot at it. Um, so I think it's important to keep and not end relationships that you've had for years and years just because somebody's voting a certain way now, or and I would say this to either party, but I would like to get back to like I was talking about the beginning. We didn't talk about politics. All my friends when I was growing up, I would say a lot of us were somewhat aware of what was going on, but we didn't sit around and just talk politics. We didn't argue about that stuff. We talked about this typical stuff teenagers or whoever would, discuss. To me, I'd like to get back to a little bit of that. It's important, of course, but it shouldn't be, I think, everybody's sole reason for, being friends with somebody, liking somebody, whatever. And I think the more people that have conversations and having events like these, and I think that just helps a lot. Because I usually find if you can get people in the same room together, they'll find that they have a lot more in common than they have differences. But that being said, there will be differences, so be prepared for those as well. But anyway, I don't know if we're about out of time, and if there was any other question, I'd be willing to I give you a quick answer. Partisan paradigms are shifting quickly. Yeah.
We are at 1 minute past 8. So yes, we
Out
are
of
in
time.
fact out of time. Thank you so much.
Yeah, no problem.
Your closing remarks were really a advertisement for Braver Angels, which
Well,
is an organization that a number of our league members belong to. I mean,
right.
that's exactly what they're talking about. Talk to
Yeah.
people that you
And I'm
don't.
not taking sides on anything, but one thing I don't like is when I see like the hypocrisy from either side, and I do see it from both sides. I'd like to get to a point where we could all agree on facts and say, okay, well, that is a fact, and yeah, you were wrong. Yeah, okay, I was wrong because that's a fact. Now we're not there yet, and maybe we'll get back to that point at some time. But it does make reporting very difficult, and I think it makes for organizations like yourselves, it makes it hard. But I think keep fighting the good fight. So
Thank you so much for those great words. And thank you everybody for coming tonight. And if you have friends that weren't here, obviously tell them that this will be up on our website, usually in a couple of days, 4 or 5 days. So
sure,
thank you
and
again, Sean.
yeah, sure. And just if anybody does want to reach out for anything or had a question that we didn't get to, you can find me nprillinois.org as the website. You can find me on that, and my email's there too. So that's just the easiest way.
All right.
All
Thank
right.
you.
Thank
Good
you guys.
night.
Appreciate it. Good luck.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.